email, therefore it's not showing.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to People's Question Time online. If you wish to tweet about the event tonight, the hashtag is #PQT. We have 5 core topic areas and will spend up to 19 minutes on each. Other questions relating to the Mayor and Assembly's remit outside of these core topics can be asked in the final section. This is how it works. For each topic, the Chair will take approximately 5 questions. 2 of these will be live video questions taken from members of the public who submitted questions whilst registering through our london.gov website. 3 additional questions, or more if we have time, will be taken from the most liked questions posted by registered audience members from our live chat forum. The Chair will direct these to the Mayor or an Assembly member. To make sure we get through as many questions as possible and cover a range of issues, duplicated questions will not be asked. Please keep your questions short and on topic, and refrain from abusive or defamatory remarks. These will not be posted. With so many of you online, we will not be able to ask everyone's question. After the event, registered audience members will receive a feedback form with details of how to submit questions to the Mayor and London Assembly. We will finish tonight at 9 p.m. sharp. This event is being broadcast live and recorded. For those with hearing impairments, there will be live subtitles throughout the event, as well as a British Sign Language interpreter, who should be visible to you in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. For anyone wishing to have a transcript of the event, this will be available on request after the event. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce your Chair this evening, the Assembly Member for Brent and Harrow and Chair of the London Assembly, Navin Shah.
Good evening and welcome to People's Question Time. The session is taking place online. The Mayor and the London Assembly work to improve life for Londoners and make our city a great place to live and work. That is why we want to hear from you about things that need to be improved. The London Assembly holds the Mayor to account and to ensure that all his policies, strategies, and actions are in the best interest of Londoners. We're always here to make sure that the Mayor is doing what's right for Londoners and our great city. Tonight is your chance to voice concerns and ask the Mayor and Assembly members what we are doing for the capital and its people, and that's you. So we thank you in advance for your questions tonight. We are about to be ready, so let me introduce jointly who are with us tonight. Our London Assembly members, and they are Tony Arbour, who's the Deputy Chairman of London Assembly, Janet Arnold, OBE, Sean Bailey, Sean Berry, Andrew Buff, Leonie Cooper, Unmesh Desai, Tony Devnish, Florence Ashlomi MP, Nikki Gavron, Susan Hall, Dr. Alison Moore, Stephen O'Connell, Caroline Pigeon MBE, Keith Prince, Murad Qureshi, Caroline Russell, and last but not least, Dr. Onkar Sahota. These are the members who are virtually with us tonight. Before we begin our questions, I wanted to share a few thoughts with you in my role as the Chair of the London Assembly. I would very much have rather be speaking to you all in person in one of the London locations, but it is a small consolation that we do not have to leave the homes on such freezing February evening. The London Assembly represents you, the Londoners. We are here to hold the Mayor to account, to challenge his decisions, and make sure that he fulfills the pledges to you, to Londoners. As London deals with the desperate economic and social consequences of the pandemic, our role is even more important than ever before. And that is why we held an extraordinary meeting of the London Assembly to examine the impact that the pandemic is having on our city and also to address the concerns of Londoners about the new strain of COVID-19. And that is why we held a meeting last week with the Minister for COVID vaccine deployment. We asked him whether Londoners are getting their fair share of COVID-19 vaccine and how we can support vaccine uptake amongst Black, Asian minority and ethnic communities. Speaking personally as a British Indian, I urge BAME Londoners to ignore vaccination disinformation and turn to truth, the NHS for trusted COVID-19 advice. I had my vaccination, and when it is your turn, I implore you to make sure that you take the vaccine without any fear or hesitation. And be assured the vaccine is safe and will help protect you, your loved ones, and everyone from this terrible virus. Assembly members have a duty to you as Londoners to investigate the issues that impact your lives. Beyond COVID-19, we've been closely scrutinizing the delivery of Crossrail and the Elizabeth Line. In our latest report from Transport Committee, we said that the Mayor and Transport for London need to have a Sherlock-style forensic focus to get the project over the line. In December, we called for the implementation of a 5-point plan to tackle homelessness in London and to help at least 10,000 rough sleepers a year find a long-term home. And we delved to the details of Mayor's latest draft budget. We highlighted that the London Fire Brigade is relying on reserves to keep afloat and that the London Stadium, home of West Ham United, is costing Londoners more than £8 million per year to run. The work of the draft budget continues, but it is fair to say that our city is facing a severe funding crisis, which is deeply, deeply worrying to all of us. We continue to call for urgent measures to help those trapped in their homes by the cladding scandal. And with schools closed, we are investigating the impact the pandemic is having on young Londoners and their mental health. To conclude, we remain and we continue to be committed in our duty to hold the Mayor to account in the interest of all Londoners. So may I thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to answering your questions this evening. I now invite the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to give us an opening address. Mr. Mayor, very welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, and welcome to People's Question Time. This event, as the title suggests, is about you rather than me or the London Assembly. It's your chance to ask questions about the work we're doing on your behalf. But before we get started, I'd like to touch on some of the major challenges facing our city right now and why I'm more determined than ever to tackle these head on. London gave me the opportunities to go from the council estate where I grew up to being mayor of the greatest city on earth. 5 years on, I still wake up every day passionate about delivering the promises I made to Londoners to make this a fairer city where everyone can get the opportunities to reach their full potential. These last 5 years have been incredibly tough. We've had the horrific Grenfell Tower fire, a series of cowardly terrorist attacks, the chaos and confusion of Brexit, relentless government austerity. And now, after all this, the biggest public health and economic emergency London has ever known. More than 16,000 Londoners have lost their lives to this awful virus. I'm sure our thoughts and prayers are with all the grieving families across our communities tonight. We still face some extremely difficult months ahead, but the way Londoners have come together, the manner in which our key workers have responded in the most brave and extraordinary of ways, and the positive news about the vaccine rollout means that we can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. There is reason to hope. As we now look to the future and a post-COVID world, we're working more and more on how we can support Londoners out of the economic crisis. That's why my mantra at City Hall is now jobs, jobs, jobs. This means doing everything in my power to protect existing jobs and to create as many new, high-quality ones as possible. And it means laying the foundations for a fair, inclusive and green economic recovery. Another big part of my job in the coming months will be standing up for Londoners against yet more government austerity. Shamefully, the government is using this pandemic as an excuse to hit London's public services, including the police, fire service, and Transport for London, with a new round of spending cuts. So I'll be doing everything I can to ensure that rather than cutting back, the government invests more in London to support our economy and to create new jobs. Lastly, I want to touch on a difficult issue that's still very much a top priority for me as mayor, and that's tackling violent crime. Crime has been falling well before the pandemic, but we're far from complacent. That's why we're taking strong action to keep crime as low as possible by being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. As part of this, we've put over 1,000 extra police officers on the streets since 2016, and we've invested record amounts in new positive activities for young Londoners. Let me just finish with this. We still face a bumpy road ahead, but we can be optimistic about London's future, a city where we can build on our achievements over the past 5 years, such as starting a record number of new council homes rather than building the luxury penthouses that were prioritised in the past, standing up for EU Londoners in our city, making transport more affordable for millions of people, cutting toxic air pollution by a third, and so much more. My promise to you is that I'll continue to fight for this vision for our city, to make London an even better place to live and work than before the pandemic. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. We will now begin taking questions in the following order, and following sections are how the event is organized tonight. We first have transport, then policing and safety, followed by air quality and environment, housing, followed by London economic recovery, and the last topic will be anything else which has not already been covered, which could be, for example, education, health, or culture, etc. The floor will be yours, of course, all the time. Questions about COVID-19, let me remind you, will be taken throughout the event in whichever section they fit the best. For each topic, we will have 2 live questions and as many questions as we can from the live chat, which is available to those of you who have pre-registered. So please note, the chat is for questions only, to allow us to focus on answering as many questions as possible tonight. Comments will not be published for the obvious reasons. Try to ask questions on the topic being discussed at the right time, as otherwise they may be missed. Remember to keep your questions short and succinct. I will also be asking the Mayor and Assembly members to keep their answers short and sweet and to the point as well, so we can fit in as many questions as we possibly can. Most importantly, you can like other questions. That's the trick here. And those that have the most likes will be asked first. assuming that they are on topic and that they have not been asked already. So it is now time to hear your questions. Let us start with the first topic, which is on transport. Our first topic is transport, as I said, so you can start adding your questions on this topic into the chat box now. Can I first of all welcome Manos Samatas from the London Borough of Haringey, who will ask our first question. Manos.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Mr. Mayor, is about transport, my question. And when we reopen society, Londoners, I'm sure other Londoners do want to carry on using transport, but we really don't miss the cramped, full trains. So what is your plan and London's plan for the post-COVID transport for London?
Mr. Mayor.
Minos, thank you for your question. We have been working across London, City Hall as the Mayor, London councils, Transport for London, the police, civic society, businesses in a recovery plan. You're absolutely right. We've got a plan for when lockdown is lifted now. The good news is TfL has world-leading enhanced cleaning across the entire estate, tube, trams, overground and buses. And we've also asked Imperial College to test to make sure our transport is safe, and they regularly test to see if COVID, the virus, is present. And here's the good news. There's not been one example of COVID being found on the public transport estate, which should give Londoners confidence. But the reality is, Manos, that for the foreseeable future, people will understandably be reluctant to go to tubes that are busy, where people are cheek by jowl. So we've got to make sure we plan to continue to provide a full transport service and to stagger start times for rush hour and close times for rush hour. And that's why we're trying to encourage more and more Londoners to walk, to cycle, and to safely use public transport. Here's the good news. We've, before the pandemic, trebled the amount of segregated cycle lanes in just 4 years. We did in 4 years 3 times what the previous mayor did in 8 years. But over the course of the last year, we've now multiplied by 5 times the amount of safe cycling. We've increased hugely the amount of walking space. We now have air quality monitors to make sure the air is safe. And because of our policies, Manos, the air in London is safer. So more walking, more cycling, more safe public transport, and hopefully fewer people using their cars as they have in other parts of the world. We don't want to replace one public health crisis, COVID, with another one, poor quality air.
Member Russell. Move on to the next question.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yes, really good question, Manos, and it's something that we were discussing just this morning in the Transport Committee, because we have a complete disruption to our whole transport system. We've got many fewer people taking the tube, getting on buses at the moment, a lot of people still driving in cars, and an awful lot of people riding bikes and walking. And we've really got to think, as the Mayor was saying, about what we have as we come forward. And I'd agree with everything I think that the Mayor said so far, but I'd just say a few extra things. One of the really important things is that our streets, if we're making our streets good for walking and cycling, they have got to work for disabled people. If you're walking with a white cane or using a wheelchair, you've got to be able to get around safely. And that, I think, is needs to be a real focus for Transport for London as we rebuild our transport system, as we get into the recovery phase. I think another thing we need to think about is making sure that our buses can work really well, particularly in outer London, so that people aren't tempted to get in a car instead, because we know that air pollution from cars is damaging our health. There's more and more evidence coming out about this. And so making sure that there are good, affordable choices for people for public transport and safe conditions for walking and cycling is really important. And I'd just say there's three things we need. We need to reduce the amount of miles that are driven altogether. We need to clean up the vehicles on the road, and that's going to be sorted out with the ultra-low emission zone. We need to make sure it's safe for people to walk and cycle. But the way to reduce the miles that get driven may be one of the solutions for the mayor's problems with the costs, with funding transport at the moment, and that may be a smart, fair, privacy-friendly road pricing system that would actually bring in some money so that the people catching the bus and catching the tube aren't paying to fix the potholes in London, which is what's happening at the moment.
Thank you. Can I bring in Assemblymember Devenish for his brief comments before we move on to the next question? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. What we need in transport is for the Mayor to listen. Public consultation is key so Londoners have their say on issues that may or may not be the right issue, but Londoners should have their say, be it cycle lanes, be it the congestion extension. It is important that the Mayor listens. He has deliberately not done public consultation during COVID, which is his right, but actually he knows full well with online platforms he could do so and listen to Londoners, because many of my constituents, disabled, elderly, are having real trouble getting around London because of the congestion zone. It's an unfair tax, and if he wants to implement it, he should at least consult Londoners. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Manus, for your question and starting us off this evening. Can we now welcome Sapna Chadha from Brent, who will ask our second question on transport tonight. Sapna.
Okay. My question on transport, the TfL finances have suffered massively with the pandemic, but already had the huge debts of 5.2 billion from the Crossrail development. I've seen no real evidence of reducing costs, such as taking half the trains out of service during non-peak hours and cutting jobs. How are you proposing to cut costs and not just push the cost onto Londoners and central government? Please, can you explain?
Mr. Mayor, your explanation on the cost aspects.
Well, Sapna, thank you very much for your question. We're the only public transport authority in the Western world not subsidised by central government. In fact, because of the deal reached between the previous mayor and the previous chancellor, we have to rely hugely on fares from passengers to pay for our services. 72% of our services are paid for by fares. The remainder, up to 86%, by congestion charge, by advertising, and by property. All those things have collapsed due to the pandemic. Since I've been elected mayor, though, the good news is we've managed for the first time in the history of TfL, reduced year on year the operating costs for TfL, never done before by Ken Livingstone or Boris Johnson, by £1 billion a year, like for like. We've also managed to reduce the operating deficit I inherited from the previous guy by more than 71%. And also I managed to increase our cash reserves by more than 16% to £2 billion, at the same time as freezing our fares for 5 years, Sapna. The previous mayor increased our fares by more than 42%. I've frozen them over 5 years. But here's the bad news. The previous mayor borrowed more than £7 billion while he was mayor, and some of the money I'm paying back in debt is on interest accrued by the previous mayor. So I'm saying to the government, look, until we get the number of passengers coming back to TfL that were before, which may be some time to pay for our services, we'll need support from central government. Central government have given a blank cheque to the privatised train operating companies for 18 months. They've given other checks to other people across the country. For some reason, they're refusing to support London. And I spent today speaking to businesses in London. They need a good transport authority supported by the government. So I'm lobbying the government for more support. But I worry they're attaching these really, really stringent conditions on London. One of them was referred to by a previous Assembly member, increasing the congestion charge they've imposed on us, making it 7 days a week. They want to take away free travel from under 18s. They want to take away free travel from over 16. So I'll continue to fight against the government's draconian conditions, but I need the support of Londoners to avoid Londoners having to pay the price for doing the right thing during the pandemic and staying at home.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question, which is from Tim Root. He's from Haringey. And the question, Mr. Mayor, is due to the deadly effects of air pollution, particularly for disadvantaged communities and the climate emergency, will you take steps to cut petrol/diesel traffic by a fifth by May 2024, in line with the guidance of the Committee on Climate Change? Mr. Mayor, your response.
Tim, that's a cracking question. I think you're spot on. We've got to address the issue of the social injustice caused by poor quality. It is a fact that it's the poorest Londoners, least likely to own a car, who suffer the worst consequences of air pollution. For me, it's an issue of social justice. When I became mayor, we discovered, hidden away, a report that showed there were 500 schools in areas where the air was unlawful. King's College did a piece of work, and they said, according to the previous mayor's policies, it would take 193 years to make our air lawful. But here's the good news. Because of our policies, King's College say we can bring it within lawful limits within 6 years from when I was first elected, and we're making progress. Because of the world's first ultra-low emission zone, we've reduced the amount of poor quality air by more than a third. There are 97% fewer schools in parts of London where the air is unlawful, 94% fewer homes in parts of London where the air is unlawful. I want to thank the Green Party for supporting me with these policies. I want to thank the Liberal Democrats for supporting Labour colleagues. All these policies were fought every step of the way by the Conservatives, and I'm really pleased that the coalition of Labour, Greens and Lib Dems have got these policies through, but we've got to go further. You're spot on, Tim. We've got to extend the ultra-low emission zone up to the North Circular and South Circular. We've got to lobby the government to finally stop delaying with a new environment bill. We've got to make progress to make London zero carbon by 2030. I want more powers and resources to deal with the pollution from the River Thames, from construction, from our housing. And again, if we manage to get the right result on May the 6th, if I get a big mandate, I can say to the government, Londoners want this, give us the powers and resources.
Right. I have indication from Assembly Member Pigeon, followed by Assembly Member Prince. In that order, please.
Thank you, Chair. Tim, that is a really good question. And you're right, the Mayor talks a good policy in some of these areas, particularly around the ultra-low emission zone, which, as a Liberal Democrat, I fully support. But the elephant in the room here is the Silvertown Tunnel. The Mayor is pushing ahead with this, which is going to cost around £2 billion over the life of this project, building a motorway under the Thames. And when you see the report out today from the British Lung Foundation, if you see the coroner's report last year into the case of a child who died on the South Circular, naming air quality as the cause, we absolutely need to be tackling that. And this goes against everything in the rest of the Mayor's strategy of building this motorway under the Thames. But I want the government to really support London and the country to get people out of their cars. And I would like to see a car scrappage scheme rolled out across London, across the country. But instead of encouraging people to buy a cleaner car, I would like to see mobility credits. So you can have membership of a Zip car type club. You can have membership of the Santander hire bikes. You can use credits to use public transport. And I think that would be a really smart way forward. And I did want to finally just pick up a point from the previous questioner about whether the Mayor should be cutting trains and other services during this pandemic. Absolutely not. For those people who need to travel, we need to make sure they can travel safely and socially distanced. And the worst thing we could ever do coming out of this pandemic would be to slash our bus services, slash our train services. We need to invest and grow our public transport rather than the opposite. And road pricing is going to be the key for funding going forward.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Platner spoke about cutting costs, and that's absolutely the right approach. But unfortunately, as you've already seen, this Mayor is determined not to cut costs. And as a result of that, he has to invent new taxes in order to raise money for the shortfall. And as many of you will have seen, there's a new proposal to introduce an outer London tax, i.e. if you want to come into London, you'll have to pay £3.50, £5.50. Well, of course, if you're in London, it doesn't affect you. But if you're outside London, or if you're like both of my boroughs, where you have reliance on the shops for people coming into the borough, they will all be hit by this. It's ironic, isn't it, that if you look behind the mayor, he has a sign that says London is open. Well, clearly, going forward, it'll only be open if you're prepared to pay £3.50 or £5.50 for the privilege of coming in.
Right. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Moore, very quickly, if you want to come in, I want to take next two questions after that. Thank you. Assembly Member Moore.
Just to be very clear, the Mayor was clear about the fact that he'd got TfL's finances back on track following the previous Mayor's record. The challenge that TfL faces is because 70% of the income comes from fares, and during the COVID crisis, Londoners quite rightly stayed off public transport, particularly in the first lockdown, and that created a big difficulty for TfL's finances. We have a number of, you talk about the Mayor looking at taxes, but frankly, the one that we're all interested in, and it is a cross-party support for the Mayor in calling for vehicle excise duty to be devolved to the Mayor, and the government are refusing to do that. So the Mayor is being creative in the ways in which we could raise money to support London Transport. You have supported it, and the government are not supporting it. So I think that tells you a great deal about the attention to making London Transport affordable and keeping TfL affordable.
Okay, we have very limited amount of time left. Two questions I'll read out. The first one is from Jane Maguire from Hounslow. Says, I'm a London bus driver. Too many of my colleagues have already died. When will we get the vaccine? And the second question is from Sarah in Waltham Forest, who says, why are you planning to make passengers and transport workers pay for the funding of TfL instead of big businesses? Why don't you stand up for working class? Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. So Jane, firstly, it is heartbreaking that your colleagues have lost their lives in the numbers that they have. I'll again use the opportunity to pass on my condolences to all the bereaved families, some who may be watching this. So Jane, I am lobbying Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health, but also the Joint Committee in charge of vaccinations and immunisations, about making sure that for those workers in the front line, like transport workers like yourself, police officers, teachers, support staff, and some others like those who work in shops, that they're given priority when it comes to the vaccine. Hopefully by the 15th of February, we'll have made sure that those above the age of 70, above the age of 80, those who work in the NHS and care sector, those who are clinically extremely vulnerable have received the vaccine. And so we're lobbying the government and this joint committee to include colleagues like yours as well. And so I'll continue to keep you updated about the progress we make lobbying the government to do so. They're in charge of deciding who gets the vaccine next. In relation to Sarah's question, one of the reasons why after 8 years of the fares going up by more than 42% from the previous mayor, the most expensive fares in Western Europe, I froze them for 5 years. Again, the Tories opposed my plans to freeze them for 5 years, is to help people like you. So the average Londoner has saved £200 over the last 5 years. We've also introduced the Hopper bus fare, the unlimited bus travel within an hour, because in outer London in particular, a bus is often the only form of public transport open. What's happened though? The government's now forcing me to increase fares by inflation plus 1%. So they're going to go up by 2.6% from the middle of March. Not something I wanted to do, but another condition attached by the government, another example of the government punishing Londoners for doing the right thing.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm afraid we must move on. We are out of time on transport. to the questioners, if we didn't get to answer your specific question, the online feedback form, which will be emailed to registered audience members, will explain to you how to submit your questions to get a reply after the event. So we now move on to the next section, which is on policing and safety. And this includes the police services, the fire resilience, as well as, if you like, any issues in terms of safety, in terms of health. So don't forget, Can I first welcome James Mardell from City of London, who will ask our first question on policing and safety.
The epidemic of knife crime must be addressed. Mr. Mayor, your default response of blaming the government for knife crime does very little to present a strong leader. With you closing over half of London police stations during your incumbency, whilst knife offences rising by 49%, your actions as mayor are clearly not working. Therefore, how are you curbing this rise that is driving fear into communities and dictating Londoners' basic decisions, such as letting their children go out to play?
Well, James, thank you for your question. I think would be clear, the responsibility for knife crime lies with the individual committing the knife crime. Just for clarity, because you may have misunderstood the question you were reading, although yes, it's true, 38 police stations have been closed during my time as mayor. More than 75 were closed during the time of the previous mayor, for the simple reason the government's been making massive cuts to the Met Police budget since 2010. Across the country, we've lost more than 21,000 police officers, including thousands of police officers in London, many police staff in London, community support officers in London, and plus the need to close police stations. What have I been doing over the last 5 years? I've been using monies raised from council tax and monies raised from business rates to both invest in policing, more invested by my administration than any mayor in the past, more than 1,300 additional officers since I became mayor, been tough on crime. We've got a new violent crime task force doing a really good work across London, but also we've been investing in the causes of crime by investing more than £70 million in providing constructive things for young people to do, because we've seen youth clubs close down over the last 10 years, cuts made to schools and other big issues. More than 110,000 young Londoners now have constructive things to do. And let me tell you some good news. I'm not complacent, because every loss of life is heartbreaking for the family. This weekend, 2 men lost their lives because of a knife crime. But because of the brilliant work of the police, the Violent Crime Task Force, the Violent Suppression Units, we've managed to, over the last few years, seen a reduction in knife crime with injury. It's going down. We should welcome that. No complacency. Knife crime of those below the age of 25 is going down. Good news. No complacency. Youth violence has been going down. Gun crime has been going down. Burglary been going down, moped-enabled crime going down, but we've got to recognise that as lockdown is lifted, there could well be an increase in crime. And that's why yesterday, in my regular catch-up with the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner, we were talking about the additional things we've got to do to make sure that we are vigilant against the increase in knife crime, particularly amongst young Londoners. It's made much harder, though. I've got to be straight with you, James, as the Mayor. It's made much harder if there are further cuts imposed on our city, further cuts on our police, on our fire service, on our councils, which mean fewer youth facilities for young people. So look, I'm not going to apologise for telling you how it is. I feel like I've got one arm tied behind my back, but I'll continue to support the police and our youth facilities and our youth workers at the same time as lobbying for more resources from government.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bailey, you also want to reply.
Thank you for the question, James. You're correct that the trend under our current mayor of crime has been up. And of course, the mayor said that crime's going down now. And I think a lot of that's been because of the lockdown. Many communities are very nervous, particularly young people, about what's going on. I think the trend started when the mayor removed £38 million from the police staffing budget, which meant the numbers were always were never going to grow in the early part of the mayor's term, and we needed those police officers on the road. We needed them to be providing reassurance to communities and to be pursuing criminals as well. The other thing as well, while crime is rising under this mayor, even during lockdown, gun crime is up 18%, according to MOPAC. It says that the mayor hasn't got a grip what's going on the road, and he needs to do that, because unless he gets on top of that, we'll see a massive spike in crime after London opens up again, and that's something we absolutely just don't need to see. And whilst the mayor is threatening to remove huge sums away from the policing budget, I think it dampens police morale as well, and it certainly doesn't make communities feel safe. So there's a long way to go with repairing crime in London, and I think the mayor needs to take more responsibility and stop passing the buck to other parties. Crime in London is out of control, and the mayor is responsible and can get his grip if he changes his direction.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Desai, you want to answer James's question as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. James, I actually represent the City of London at the Assembly. And let me say straight away, what actually undermines police morale is the lack of funding from central government, and also the Metropolitan Police Federation made a call for police officers to be given some priority for vaccinations, backed up by the London Assembly's Police and Crime Committee on an all-party basis. On Monday, what does Matt Hancock say? No, he's not going to prioritize police officers who are putting their necks out on the front line to protect us. The chair of the Federation called Matt Hancock's action, quotes, a kick in the teeth for police officers, unquote. Also, let's get some facts clear. Since 2010, austerity cuts have meant that the Met has lost around £850 million in cuts in funding from central government over the last 10 years. COVID has cost the Met £34 million. Again, money the government is simply refusing to give to our police force in London. The mayor has already outlined what actions he's taken. Let me actually again put some facts over it, Chair. He has set up a new violent crime task force of 272 officers. New violence suppression units made up of 620 officers based in the highest crime rates across London. He has invested more in policing each year of his mayoralty since 2016 than the previous mayor, Boris Johnson, did in any of his last 4 years. A £45 million Young Londoners Fund to particularly help those at risk of getting caught up in crime. The establishment of England's first violence reduction unit to drive a public health approach which brings all public sector agencies together to knife crime. Increase the number of safer school officers to help drive down crime in schools. Creation of the first mayoral action crime plan for each of London's 32 boroughs. I could go on. And also he has used his budgetary powers, council tax precept and business risk to actually increase the Met's numbers by 1,300. I'll finish on this note. The government said it will give 20,000 police officers to England and Wales. We have yet to see what they're going to give to London. The mayor has asked for 6,000. The Assembly has asked for 5,000 to his police committee. 5,000, 6,000. Every single police officer out in the street helps Londoners. The government has simply not told us how many officers they're going to give to London. It is the government that is undermining the morale of the Metropolitan Police Service through its underfunding of the Met and lack of support for everything that the mayor is doing to protect this city and Londoners.
Thank you very much. James, you had a full response. Thank you very much. Can I invite Johanna Lam from Camden to ask the next question, please?
Good evening, and happy Chinese New Year for those who are celebrating it. The Mayor has envisioned London as a city of freedoms, opportunities and rights for all. Yet, in a survey of 8,000 Londoners, 74% of female respondents felt worried about their safety, and 68% worry about sexual harassment on public transport. Will there be an initiative to firstly create more gendered responses in the future of public transport, and secondly to recognise that this is an intersectional issue, where depending on your race, gender identity, sexuality or disability, people will face different problems which need different solutions?
Well, can I wish you and all Londoners of East and Southeast Asian origin a Happy New Year. Let's hope the year of the ox is better than the last year was for all of us, not just in London, but across the globe. And thank you for raising this really important issue. So one of the first things I did as mayor was to increase rapidly the amount of money we target towards violence against women and girls. It's really important that people like me recognise that for women in particular and girls, that many are targeted primarily because of their gender, when they use public transport, when they go about our city. And not only did I spend record amounts, Joanna, £45 million, I've now increased that by another £50 million because in fact, we've seen by encouraging people to report it, it's been fantastic in relation to more people coming forward, but actually crime against women and girls has increased, which is a really bad news. It's also increased during the pandemic, particularly those at the receiving end of domestic abuse and domestic violence. So we're supporting survivor groups, community groups, and groups that can provide specialist support for women and girls, as well as targeting perpetrators. It's really important we avoid victim blaming and somehow, blaming the victims or survivors of crime who often are at the receiving end many, many times before they come forward and report it. And just to reassure you, not only do we have within Borough Command Unit specialist teams trained to talk to sometimes vulnerable victims of crime, we're also supporting financially in other ways third parties to encourage people to come forward. We're providing safe havens for people to be able to report where they've been the victims of crime. And also I supported a brilliant London campaigner in relation to changing the law in relation to, for example, upskirting and other issues. And final thing I should say is I'm really pleased that I'm the first mayor that's appointed an independent victims commissioner. Claire Waxman's done a brilliant job in relation to leading a review around rape and other work with the Deputy Mayor, Sophie Linden, to really make sure we address the issue you've highlighted in your question. And it's a priority for us going forward. And any support that I can give to this area, I'll continue to give. But, and there's a really important but, we need support from the government by way of finances. If they continue to cut our budgets, mentioned, £850 million over the last 10 years. They want us to make further cuts over the next year. It makes it more and more difficult for us to support this really important area of work. So any help you can give lobbying the government, we'd really appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's move on to the top three light questions from the chat. The first question is from Adrian Stannard from Waltham Forest. The question is, Waltham Store is due to have 34-story off-site modular constructed block of flats post-Grenfell. What guarantee will there be that it will be safe? That's first question. Second, would it not be a good idea to freeze all residential tower block developments until the Grenfell cladding scandal has been solved? This question is from Alison Hill, again from Waltham Forest. And the third question is, how are you going to make London safer for everyone, especially for teenagers in areas ruled by gangs? And this question is from Karen James from Merton. Mr. Mayor, three questions for you.
Yeah, thanks, Navin. The first two questions are linked. Firstly, Aidan, just I spent a lot of time with the families and community around Grenfell. 72 Londoners, men, women, children lost their lives in a fire that's preventable because of the fact that the building was unsafe, not just because of the ACM cladding, but due to, in my view, systemic failures over a number of years. And it's really important that we look at the recommendations from phase 2. So what I've been doing, Adrian, is a number of things in relation to tall buildings. There's two issues here. One is making sure that the buildings we currently have are safe. And two is, as you imply, and the second question implied, making sure future buildings are safe as well. In relation to buildings that are already being built, we've had a real challenge trying to persuade the government to do right by the families in London who live in tall buildings. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge, we have more than double the number of tall buildings in London than the rest of the country put together. We've got more than 8,000 tall buildings in London. There's only about 12,000 across the country. And because that built environment can't be trusted in relation to stay put because of not just ACM cladding, but other cladding, the fire service have a real challenge. And that's why you're seeing leaseholders paying exorbitant amounts in waking watches, but also not being able to sleep at night because they're worried they live in a death tower. The announcement yesterday from Robert Jenrick from the government was shameful because there was nothing announced for those people who live in buildings below 18 metres which are still unsafe, and they get no support from the government. In relation to new build, the good news is we have world-leading policies to make sure every new build, tall building, is safe, but also buildings that aren't tall are safe as well. And so I'd encourage you to look at the New London Plan, which has policies in here in relation to fire safety measures for the first time, in relation to policies requiring the highest standards of fire safety, including fire safety lifts. We've also made sure there are sprinklers in every tall building, and the fire service have been involved in our world-leading plans. And as part of the work we're doing around new buildings, there's something called the London Development Panel, and everybody who is part of that's got to make sure they sign up to the very highest of standards going forward. But that will reassure you in relation to new buildings. But I am concerned still about the current buildings that have already been built. In relation to the question about gangs, this is a really important issue. And so it is a fact that a significant amount of violent crime is sometimes linked with gangs. We've been doing lots of work in this area. One of the really successful projects we've done is in relation to funding response and rescue in relation to county lines and linked with gang work. And we've seen more and more people leaving gangs because of our gang exit work that we're funding from City Hall. Again, monies that we've diverted this work because of council tax and business rates money we've raised from City Hall in the face of opposition from some on this call tonight on the Assembly, and in the face of cuts from government. We've got to encourage young people to have positive, constructive things to do rather than being groomed into joining criminal gangs because of a lack of belonging, because of deprivation and inequalities. And that's why I'm not going to apologise for diverting business rates to the Young Londoners Fund and to England's first violence reduction unit, as Unmesh said. We've got to invest in young people rather than allow them to be distracted into criminal gangs.
To bring in Assembly Member Cooper, followed by Assembly Member Buff, very brief answers, please. We are out of time pretty much. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say something on the issue of fire. Grenfell has to be a wake-up call. We've had 10 years where we had a bonfire of the red tape was announced in 2010, and we have to understand a bonfire of red tape on health and safety is an absolute mistake. We have to put right the problems that have emerged in buildings. The London Assembly has worked on this. We did a report into the problems that emerged from the La Canal house fire, and we've seen what's just happened with a building going up in Barkingside. We cannot ignore the fact that putting wood on the outside of buildings, making adjustments to buildings that already exist, we've made some mistakes. We have to put them right. I'm glad the government this week has announced more money, but the Mayor is absolutely right. It's not enough. And it's not just for London, it's for the whole of the country. We've got lots of people who are just absolutely desperate. They're living in properties where they're scared to sleep at night. We have to sort that out. But we also have to put back in proper controls and arrangements for building regulations, proper inspections when buildings are on site, so that new buildings going up are going to be safe. And we've still got buildings that are being completed and we can't go on doing this that are not safe. We have to change. We have to support the fire brigade, because although there has been a look in the Grenfell inquiry into what they did on the night at Grenfell, frankly, expecting them to buildings that are unsafe and that we've made more unsafe, that's not going to help them fight fires properly. We have to support our brave firefighters. Thank you.
Assembly Member Boff, very briefly, please.
I'm chair of the London Assembly's Planning Committee, and we recently did an investigation into tall buildings, which was alluded to earlier by one of the questions. Let's face it, tall buildings are not the right environment to bring up children. They add to the costs of leaseholders. They are less energy efficient than lower rise buildings. And generally speaking, they are a bad investment. And we shouldn't be building any more residential tower blocks in London. And yet the Mayor keeps building them. He keeps putting in planning applications for very high blocks, and it's as though they don't care about the people who actually have to live in them. There is something of a revolt going on because we know that planning committees are starting to reject these plans at Cannons Park, at Arnos Grove, and the people are thoroughly fed up with their landscape being taken over by tall buildings and being forced to live in homes that they wouldn't actually choose. Let's be very, very clear. These tower blocks are not homes. They are unsafe warehousing for families, and we should stop building them now.
Thank you very much. We are definitely way over time on safety topic. So if you didn't get your question, the online feedback form, which will be emailed to registered audience members, will explain how to submit your questions to get a reply after the event. So we now move on to air quality and environment topic. If you want to start adding your questions on this topic into the chat box now. So can I welcome, first of all, Jackie Jenkins from the London Borough of Hackney, who will ask our first question on this topic. Jackie.
How does closing roads and pushing traffic onto main roads achieve cleaner air? As a disabled single person, the road closures that Mr. Khan has encouraged and supported has made my life and others I know completely miserable. I'm not a car owner, but I do rely on a car quite often, especially during the pandemic. And as an ad note, some of what I've heard on here today has made me extremely angry because whatever's going on isn't working. You need to fix it.
Mr. Mayor.
Okay, Jackie, thank you for your question. I'm really happy to look into the particular plans in Hackney. So let me explain what's happened across London. There are councils who've been encouraged by the government to bid for money to have what's called low traffic neighbourhoods. And I support the idea of having active travel and less reliance on cars. And you're spot on. Actually, non-disabled people use cars far more than disabled people. And so it's really important to understand the consequences of a reliance on cars as we recover from this pandemic, which is one health crisis, COVID, replaced by another one, poor quality air. The government said if the council wants to get the money from the government, they must bring in these schemes urgently. And that's why when a Conservative member in a previous question complains about a council not consulting, he can't have it both ways. The only way the councils would get the money is if they got the schemes up and running. If the schemes weren't up and running, they won't get the money. And now the Conservative member complains about a council not consulting. So there have been some schemes that have not been successful, and those schemes, councils are looking at how they can tweak them, amend them, and in some cases, pull them out altogether. We TfL have got some schemes that weren't working properly. There was one scheme on Euston Road, Jackie, which we changed because it wasn't working. So I'm really happy. If you give your details to the staff, I'll get one of my team to speak to Hackney about the particular scheme you're talking about, because what we don't want is unintended consequences of people like you who need to rely on cars sometimes because you're disabled. And we don't want people like you adversely affected if the scheme can be approved. So if you give your details, please, to the staff, Jackie, I'll go away and speak to Hackney and see if that scheme can be improved in some way.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Jackie, thank you for your question. We move on to the next question, which is from Richard Atkins from Camden. Richard, please go ahead with your question.
Hello, thank you. My question is, how do you intend to support the growing demand for a real green recovery following the coronavirus pandemic?
Richard, thank you for your question. It's a cracking question. So, Richard, a number of things we've done. So one of the things I've done working with partners across London, including London councils, businesses, civic society, faith groups, voluntary community groups, trade unions, is to come up with a recovery plan for our city. And the really good news is that as part of our recovery missions, there's 9 of them, a green recovery is crucial. Because what we don't want to do is go back to business as usual. And I hate to use the word opportunity when it comes to this awful, awful pandemic, but there are some opportunities here to have a new normal. So it's not a return to business as usual. And one of those, by the way, is to have a green recovery. And that means not just encouraging more people to walk, cycle, use public transport, less reliance on cars is important, but also future jobs. I don't want to see London being deregulated, race to the bottom, as Singapore on the Thames. I want us to think about our future being high-skilled, well-paid green jobs. And here's a couple of opportunities. We've got COP26, Richard, coming to Glasgow later on this year. And so I'm working with cities across the world about how cities can push the agenda along by seeing the solution to some of the challenges. Secondly, we're doing what we can to make sure that when it comes to adult skills, we're now in charge of adult skills, Richard. We're making sure that we skill up Londoners to have the skills for the jobs being created in the green economy. I had a meeting today with some of the world's leading financial and professional business community, and many of them based in London. And the really exciting thing, Richard, is they're talking about fintech, green finance, because they can see opportunities for London going forward. It's really important. As part of it, Richard, I'm really pleased we'd have more than 300 school streets. Little thing, really controversial a few years ago. Now schools want it, parents want it, children want it. You heard the previous discussion about the low traffic neighbourhoods. There are some teething problems, I accept. Some haven't been right. We'll sort that out. But a really good way to make it easier for people to walk, cycle and use public transport. This has got to be an integral part of all our policies. And one of the things I want to do, Richard, is have a really ambitious target of zero carbon by 2030. I'd rather have an ambitious target and maybe miss it by a little bit rather than not being ambitious and be the last generation that didn't get it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let's move to the top three liked questions from the chat. The first question is from Waltham Forest, who are doing extremely well, coming up with questions tonight. The question is from Claire Wiz, who says, Waltham Forest Council has approved a scheme in Walthamstow Town Square of 2 blocks of unprecedented height. Over 30% of the public realm will be given to private developers at the expense of open green space. Do you agree with this? Can you stop it? The next question is from Zach Bond from Haringey, who says, given the powerful new report from the British Lung Foundation today, which found high levels of air pollution across the city, what specific action are you taking to protect children, older people, and people with a lung condition from air pollution? Moving on to the third question, which is from Kate Langham, Waltham Forest. Given the Ella Kissy Deborah tragedy, why has the mayor allowed the air polluting redevelopment of Southall Gasworks to continue? And why has approval been granted to redevelop Lee Bridge Gasworks in an area with illegally high levels of pollution? Those are the three questions, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you very much, Navin, and thank you for those questions. And congratulations to Waltham Forest for coming top of the league table again. So in relation to the planning issue, Claire, I'm not able to talk about it for the simple reason that it will come to me. It's what we call a quasi-judicial. And if I talk about an application while it's still in the planning phase, I can be accused of being prejudicial and prejudging the application before deciding. Apologies for that. I'm in City Hall and we've got environmentally friendly lights, so they go off if I don't move around. A good example of me walking the walk, so I've got to move around to keep the lights going. So apologies for that. So, but Claire, when it comes to me, I'll make sure I have an open mind in relation to the points that were in the report that come to me. And Zach, really good question, again, from Haringey. So as I explained, a number of things we've done so far is making huge progress in relation to air quality. I'm vice chair of the C40, which are a group of cities around the world that take this issue really seriously, because I want us to be leaders rather than somebody at the back of the queue. Ultra-low emission zone, really, really good progress we've made. We're going to continue making progress by rolling that out. Really important. We're making real progress with our school streets. The air around the streets is not right. I'm really concerned about public transport. We've managed to reduce the amount of nitrogen dioxide coming from our buses by more than 90% 50% by having all our buses in London 9,000 Euro 6 compliant, which is really, really good. 4,000 of our taxis are electric. We've got to make sure that we continue to invest. But here's the bad news. I'm only responsible for the road part of things, and 50% of the poor air comes from road. The other 50% comes from buildings, construction, the River Thames. I've got no power over those sorts of things, so I'm lobbying the government to have more power. I'm really concerned about something called particulate matter. And again, the Greens and the Lib Dems working with Labour, we're making progress here, but we need the government to give us more powers and resources, and fingers crossed the Environment Bill will do that for us. Kate, Dr. Anka Sahota has been doing lots of work in relation to the Southall Gasworks on behalf of local residents. Some of these schemes predate me, and we've not got a jurisdiction to do so, but Dr. Sahota has been working really hard on these issues on behalf of local residents in Southall. And so I'll continue to listen to representations about what we can do within the limited powers we have about some of these sorts of things. But, you know, it's really important we address concerns like the ones you've raised. I'll ask my officers to look into what more can be done.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in quickly 3 Assembly members who've indicated very brief responses, please. Can I start with Assembly Member Devonish, please?
Jackie, you were spot on. The Mayor is all hot air when it comes to air quality. All his policies are to do with tax rises, ULEZ extension, congestion charge. If he really wanted to do something for air quality, he'd bring electric buses in. But even a small West Midlands city, with the greatest respect to Coventry, has beaten him on electric buses. It is all hot air from Sadiq Khan on every subject, but particularly air quality.
Assembly Member Cooper.
Well, it's nice to hear a bit of hot air from Assembly Member Devonish again. How is it that Coventry has managed to move ahead on this? Yes, because they've had support from the government, which, of course, we don't even have access to the government's Clean Air Fund in London. What we could really do with, what the Mayor could really do with, is support from government, bringing in a National Clean Air Act. And then we could have the Mayor introduce a scrappage scheme to help Londoners move away from polluting cars and polluting vans. And that's what we need nationally. We need the government to introduce a scrappage scheme. The Mayor has just talked about what he's been doing to clean up the bus fleet, clean up the taxi fleet, low emission bus zones, but we really need the government to step up and work with the Mayor. The Mayor has led with the scrappage schemes. Come on, government, Clean Air Act, scrappage nationally, support our Mayor, and let us have access in London to the Clean Air Fund that other cities do. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Russell, very, very briefly, we only got about a minute left.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just picking up again on Zach's question about the impact of air pollution on people's lungs. That health impact is so important. Now, the Mayor has done a good job in cleaning up the nitrogen dioxide pollution, but the particle pollution hasn't yet been touched. Now, what we need, or at least hardly touched, what we need the ultra low emission zone to cover the whole of London, so no one is left out. It shouldn't be stopping short at the North and South Circular. But we also need to reduce the amount of driving that is done, because that particle pollution comes from the tyres wearing on the roads. So we really need more action, and the Mayor could be doing more with road pricing to reduce the amount of driving that happens in the first place.
Thank you. We haven't got any time left, so we're going to move on to the next item of topic, which is on housing. Can you please keep liking your favorite chat questions or adding your own questions on the topic of housing now? So can we first welcome Cartin Jones from London Borough of Newham. Catherine, can you please go ahead with your question? Thank you.
Hi there. It's been touched on a little bit already, but how will the Mayor commit to both protecting leaseholders of flats with fire safety and uncompliant build issues that are not just cladding, from unaffordable, unfair costs and forced loans against our will, and support our deteriorating mental health as we navigate this scandal?
Thank you for your question. And I take from your question that you're a leaseholder. And can I just say, I've spent a lot of time over the last 3.5 years with leaseholders who feel like they've got an albatross around their neck because of the safety concerns around the building they're in. And you're spot on, it's not just ACM cladding, it's not just cladding, it's other concerns around the safety of the building that you have. They could be because you're paying for a waking watch. They could be because you can't sell. They could be because of the requirement the government's placed about having EWS1 certification. They could be concerns around safety of your building. So we've done a few things, Carlton. Firstly, from City Hall, we're working with the London Fire Brigade, which I'm responsible for, to make sure we do what we can to make these buildings as safe as we can. There is a concern, though, in relation to, as Leonie Cooper said, as brilliant as our fire service is, they can't be sure now that the built environment they go into is what they think it's going to be. So they're trying their best in relation to this, but it's quite complicated because of who owns a building, who's responsible for the building, and also leaseholders, frankly speaking, can't afford to pay the cost of this. So we've been lobbying the government. We've made some progress. The announcement yesterday, the £3.5 billion, we've been working with campaigns across the country. Brilliant work from Andy Burnham in Manchester, Steve Rotherham in Liverpool, and others across the country with residents like you and the Cladding Scandal campaign and others across the country. But as I said earlier on, the money announced yesterday, welcome though it is, only helps those above 18 metres with cladding. It doesn't pay for all the other remediation work required or those buildings below 18 metres, including Barkingside and the development in Sutton, which was smaller buildings of 5 stories, which burnt within 5 minutes to the ground. So I'll continue to do what I can from City Hall. We've got limited funds to pay for ourselves, but we'll continue to lobby. We're also going to make sure that we continue to listen to people like you about what more things we can do in the short term to improve the quality of your life. And that means, for example, increasing the number of surveyors who do EWS1, giving them indemnity from the government, but also making sure there are less requirements on the EWS1 forms, because I know many of you can't sell your buildings because it's not deemed, inverted commas, safe. You're having to pay for the waking watch. You're not able to sleep at night time. And so I'll do what I can from City Hall. Any other ideas that you've got, we're more than happy to listen. Tom Copley, my brilliant Deputy Mayor for Housing, has been working with residents across London and working with campaigners to make sure we continue to put pressure on the government. Ultimately, what the government's got to do is pay in advance for all the stuff to be repaired. And then later on, they can argue with the landowner about reimbursing them. We don't want you caught in the crossfire in the meantime. The government's got to step in. Nobody else can.
Thank you. Brief comments from Caroline Pigeon, Assembly Member.
Thank you, Chair. The Mayor is absolutely right. The government have got to step in here, and it's an absolute scandal that people are living in unsafe buildings due to a failing system over many, many years. But the Mayor does have some levers, and I've been pushing the Mayor to put conditions on funding he gives to housing associations and developers unless they have shown and demonstrated that they've done all they can for their existing stock and that they have protected leaseholders. And the idea that if you're in a building that's under 18 metres high, that you don't qualify for any of these funding streams that are available, inadequate though they are, is completely unacceptable. And I've also written to the Mayor this week asking that he looks at whether he could be the insurer of last resort, because we can have all these new fire safety inspectors. They can't afford the insurance that's needed to carry out this work. And I'm hoping the Mayor might be able to step in here if the government fails to do so.
Thank you. Can I thank Catherine for a question, and we move on to the next one, which is from Ian Thompson. He's from Richmond upon Thames. Can I invite Ian to raise your question, please, on housing?
Right, thanks very much. My question really is, I see no reason why there should be any homeless people on the street. Much more surely can be done. And to rely on charity, who probably facilitate accommodation where they can, it just isn't a viable long-term solution. So why can't vacant property be compulsorily purchased or possession orders issued, and then the property returned to owners once longer-term answers are found, including giving the homeless the mental and physical support they need, because obviously quite often these people have complex shall we say, conditions?
Mr. Mayor.
Ian, thank you for your question. It's particularly poignant at this time of year when it's last time it was -5 in London. So we've done a number of things. We when the pandemic began last year, from City Hall secured record number of hotel rooms in London before the lockdown, actually, and we began a policy called Everyone In. And so whereas other parts of the world, Ian, saw a number of rough sleepers catching the virus and passing it on, in London, far few people caught the virus who were rough sleepers, and very few rough sleepers. I think 3, unfortunately, lost their lives because of the pandemic, because of our Everyone In policy. The government gave us some money towards that, and Dame Louise Casey was brilliant inside government lobbying for this. The bad news, Ian, is this winter, the government's not giving us the financial support we need for Everyone In. So this winter, when it really is freezing literally outside, we're having to use our own limited resources, working with brilliant charities, brilliant councils to get people in. We brought in 7,000 from the peak of the pandemic earlier on this year. We've brought in a few more thousand recently, but there are still people sleeping rough. So one of the things we're doing is we continue to use hotels, but also we can't use the same hostels we had before because of the pandemic. And so we are working with councils and charities to have COVID-safe spaces. Another thing we've got is, in for good. So once somebody's in your spot and they need support, because sometimes you've got complex mental health issues, alcohol dependencies, drug dependencies, so you can't just leave somebody by themselves. And so we're providing the wraparound care because we want them to be in for good, to avoid them leaving. The good news, Ian, every year we've done this policy, about 90% of our in for good residents, rough sleepers, stay in. The bad news is there are those Londoners who have no recourse to public funds. There are those Londoners who are worried that some people may report them to the immigration authorities and they could be deported. And the bad news is we simply can't afford to do all this with the limited resources we have and the cuts. So we're relying upon the generosity of Londoners to support us. The two things to say, Chair, that Ian and others can help with is, one, we've got something called Street Link. So if you see somebody sleeping rough, there's trained outreach workers who go and have a conversation in a dignified way to see if somebody does want to come in and give them support. Really important to do it with dignity. And secondly, Londoners can donate. We've so far raised more than £60,000 through City Hall, which will go towards youth homeless people. There's a big issue around young people sleeping rough, which is really, really important. And in the long term, Ian, we need to build more genuinely affordable homes. We can't be building luxury penthouses, which are gold bricks for investors overseas. I have nothing against foreigners. Some of my best friends and family are foreigners. We've got to build homes for Londoners. That's why I'm really proud. Last year, we began building more council homes than any year since 1983. We've started building more homes for London Living Rent, but also we've started building homes that are shared ownership, part buy, part rent. We can't be building homes that the rough sleepers you're talking about can't afford to live in. But frankly speaking, we can't do it without more support from the government. We should be building homes for Londoners. That includes the rough sleepers that you care about so much.
Can I bring in Assembly Member Qureshi, please? Assembly Member Qureshi.
I'm just trying to get myself off mute. Thank you, Chair. Can I just add some more comments to what the Mayor has said? Firstly, on cladding, whilst we've had the announcement from the Minister of up to £5 billion, the huge scale of the cladding scandal is such that this is simply doesn't go far enough. We are told that actually the actual cost is probably 3 times that, and we haven't even begun tackling the problems. And it's not surprising that residents like Catherine do live in fear of their lives and their solvency in these buildings that don't meet the modern fire services. With the homelessness, the actual funding gap, which the Mayor I didn't mention, is about 24 million in emergency accommodation funding, meaning that there simply won't be enough safe spaces for tonight, for example, one of the coldest nights in London, to be put up anywhere. And yes, one of the solutions is empty properties. I'm glad to see some of our local authority colleagues are taking a lead on this, where the actual powers lie. And I do think there is some merit in discussing some of the options that the Mayor could support on that front to help help the homeless with the idle housing that we do see around more regularly now, and I suspect will do once the housing market's jammed up with all the with the properties stuck in the housing market in the tower blocks. And finally, we shouldn't also forget the number of families that are homeless. It's not just rough sleepers. The most recent statistics suggest there's about 59,000 households living in temporary accommodation in London, including something like 88,000 children. These have been driven by welfare and housing benefit cuts, which have left low-income Londoners worse off after 10 years of austerity and with an insecure and unregulated private rented sector. Those are things that I hope Mayor Sadiq can tackle in another term after May the 6th.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian, for your question. We now move on to the top 3 liked questions from the chat. We are back in Waltham Forest. The question is from Nancy Tuff. I hope I got the name right. And that is, the question is 22,000 properties are empty in London alone, many of them in newly built developments. Will you halt the regeneration schemes that facilitate the obscenity of empty homes and rising homelessness? We still stay in Waltham Forest for Rachel Lyon's question. And Rachel says, when will London provide affordable social housing? And the third one, which is, guess what? From Waltham Forest, Michael Cleverly, who says, why are high-rise blocks being allowed even when Grenfell Tower inquiry has even completed? 3 questions heavily on tower blocks and Grenfell. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for those questions from the People's Republic of Waltham Forest, Nancy, Rachel, and Michael. So Nancy, actually, Ian asked this question as well about empty properties. So the good news is where we own an empty property that's not being used, we're using that. So a good example is the fire station in Clerkenwell, Islington, which is being used for the country's first LGBTQ plus homeless shelter. Some really good work taking place there. We've also managed to work with Nancy and Ian, business owners, to lend us their buildings for what's called meanwhile use. So whilst they're waiting to make progress on a development, we can be using that building to house rough sleepers. It can be difficult because some rough sleepers need support. You can't simply give them a sleeping bag in a building because they're responsibility to provide support. But we are trying to negotiate that. But we can't take over an empty property. The law doesn't allow us to do so. And the councils, in their defence, the compulsory purchase orders are very, very difficult. But the councils have been lobbying the government, and the government hopefully are listening to the ability to use it or lose it in relation to making it easier to even have temporary use of properties that are currently sitting empty. But you're spot on, by the way. The way the current business model works is it's in the interest of investors to have regeneration that can sit empty or be not fit for purpose for Londoners. And that's why the New London Plan, which only got approved 2 weeks ago, it's been sitting for a year, gathering dust in the minister's desk. We've now finally approved that. That does give us more powers in relation to make sure it's the right form of regeneration and the right sorts of homes being built in London. And Rachel, in relation to social housing, you're spot on. So I'm very careful about using the phrase affordable housing because nobody believes housing that's called affordable housing is really affordable. And that's because when I became mayor, the definition of an affordable house was one of 2 things. It was either a house that cost £450,000 to buy, that's an affordable house for Tory politicians, or 80% of market value to rent. So I threw that in the bin. I said, it's ridiculous. When I became mayor, 0 council homes being started and only 13% in the pipeline of affordable homes, even with the dodgy definition. The good news, we started to turn that tanker around. And so last year, we began more than 17,000 genuinely affordable homes, the most ever since powers were devolved to the mayor. The most number of council homes, proper council homes, which with affordable rents, the largest number since 1983, and the largest numbers of genuinely affordable homes since the City Hall had those powers, but we need to build far, far more, far quicker. We've been given some support from the government, but nowhere near enough. We need 7 times the amount of support the government's given us to meet London's housing needs. But as long as I'm there, I'll continue to make sure we have decent homes for Londoners rather than homes that are gold bricks for foreign investors or any investor come to that.
Right. Can I invite Assembly Member Boff for a brief reply, please?
Yes, absolutely. First on cladding, look, the leaseholders were not at fault for this cladding crisis. They were not negligent. It wasn't anything they did that resulted in them being put in this leasehold hell. It was a failure of regulation. The government, and we've got some way towards persuading the government that they need to cover the costs of this for buildings over 18 metres. But I believe the government has to do the rest of the job as well. And the campaigns from the London Assembly will continue until there is justice for leaseholders. With regard to rough sleepers, you know, let's look at what the mayor's actually done. He had money, a record amount of money to spend on the affordable housing programme. Over a period of 4 years. Yet in 5 years, he's only built half the number. He's got about £500 million unallocated towards schemes for new homes. Now, just to put that in context, that is many times over the amount of money that it cost the government's Everyone In scheme, which was so successful during the pandemic of getting rough sleepers into stable accommodation. It is many times over that programme, and yet the mayor has neglected housing. This isn't a marathon. It's a dawdle. The mayor is not completing the homes that Londoners need on time. He needs to get his act together. And finally, one very small bit. I would absolutely like the mayor to confirm to me today, bearing in mind he uses this old trope about expensive penthouses. Will you, Mr. Mayor, stop any non-affordable penthouses in any GLA-backed scheme? I'm sure that's going to be very easy for you to reply to.
Well, it's people's question time, so I will leave people to ask questions to the mayor tonight. Can I invite Assembly Member Arnold to reply to the question and her comments, please?
Yes, Chair, thank you. As the representative of the People's Republic of Waltham Forest, who are out in force tonight, I would like to say thank you to them all. And I'd just like to say a couple of things. I think this is great that People's Question Time are allowing my constituencies the opportunity to bring their concerns about a development that is going to take the heart out of their community straight to the mayor. I would those to say to the mayor that I do hope that in his assessment he will go on site and maybe find the time to listen directly to the concerns of my constituents, because they do not feel that they've been listened to. I mean, at a time, can I just go on about what you call rough sleepers? You know, I've had the opportunity to go out. I went out with Tom, the Deputy Mayor for Housing. And, you know, the word rough sleeping doesn't come to mind when you see people who are desolated, who are sleeping on the streets, in alleyways, and who have nothing. And many of them have converted suitcases into covering. And so there is an issue that's got to be dealt with. And I really do think that this mayor has shown his commitment. And I would be looking forward to hearing what more he has to say and what more he will be doing in his next term as Mayor of London. Thank you.
Okay, we are now definitely out of time with this particular topic. So we now move on to the next topic, which is London's economic recovery. Can I first of all welcome Julie J. Charles from, guess where? Waltham Forest. Our first question.
Sorry.
This topic.
I didn't plan this.
Okay. Would the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and the Assembly seriously consider a proposal to sponsor the rollout of a London-wide regional development initiative for disabled people, people with lived experience of mental health and learning disabilities, and also ex-offenders based on mindset, training, and life skills rather than just on qualifications, which often is the biggest barrier for those from those most disadvantaged communities?
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for your question. It's a really important question about how we make sure all Londoners can get involved in our city and what I call fulfilling their potential. So one of the things that we're doing in your part of London is something called creative enterprise zones, but also one of the good pieces of news for the groups you care about in particular, those who are ex-offenders, those who are disabled, those who aren't accessing the joys of our city, is to give them a helping hand. And the way to do that is we're using adult education, giving free courses and free support to those who that need it. In relation to ex-offenders, one of the things I've been a big advocate for some time is for employers not to hold against somebody who's been convicted of a crime. There is a box you've got to tick sometimes when you apply for certain jobs, and that can sometimes put off people from employing. And you'll probably be aware there's a great initiative from Timpson's in relation to taking on deliberately as a proactive thing ex-offenders. And we're speaking to other employers across London about what they can do. In relation to positive stuff we've already done, if you've not had a chance to do so, and by the way, Chair, can we take the details of the questioner so I can contact her about some of the things we're doing and help she can give us going forward? We've got something called the Good Work Standard, where we give we encourage employers to meet the Good Work Standard, and they then get, if you like, preferential treatment when it comes to getting contracts, when it comes to procurement with City Hall and our partners and stuff. So those are some of the examples we're doing to encourage employers and businesses to take on board the potential of the sort of groups you're talking about. It's really important. And that includes disabled Londoners as well. But I'm more than happy to speak to you about this and my team. So what we'll do is take down your details. Please give them to the City Hall staff, and somebody from our team will be in touch to let you know what we're doing. And you may have other ideas we've not thought of that we can be doing and scaling out across London.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for your question. We move on to the next question, and welcome to Ulla Wurshan, who is from Redbridge, who will ask our second question on the economy. Ulla, do you want to come in, please?
Yeah, good evening, Mayor. My question is, what are your plans to grow London economy after Brexit, knowing fully well the negative impact Brexit has on the economy of London? And what are your strategies towards this? I'd like to know more about that. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, question to you.
Ulla, thank you for your questions. I think you've got the same lighting as I've got. If you don't move around, it goes dark. So Brexit's happened now. And so let's sort of backwards, let's look forwards. The government did do a flimsy deal with the EU in relation to goods, but not in relation to services. So by services, I think about the finances, the banks, the trading, the legal, the accountancy, the insurance, and the related services. And so 90% of our city's economy is in those sort of professional services, 90%, no deal done by them. So I met today, and I continue to meet with key players in that work to see what their needs are from the government. So the government's got to listen to the businesses, myself, City of London Corporation and others, to make sure they do get a deal in relation to these services. It's really important in relation to things called equivalence, at things called passporting and other issues in relation to what happens to data, tech, and so forth. So that's really important in relation to a good deal in relation to those services. The second thing is one of our biggest assets are EU Londoners. And for those EU Londoners who are in London, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the contribution you make to making our city the greatest city in the world. You will always be welcome here as long as I'm the mayor. We've got to make sure that we regularise your status so you're inadvertently penalised in the future going forward. So it's really important we resolve that. And that's why I'm really proud to say London is open. The third thing is we've got to not stand still. It's really important that we learn the lessons from previous crises. So in the Second World War, during the Second World War, there were wise politicians planning for the peace, planning for what happens with recovery. And that's what I've been doing with businesses across London. We have a COVID business roadmap designed by businesses across London that I chair that sets out how we recover from this awful pandemic in relation to some of the sectors that are worried: culture, creative industries, leisure, retail, tourism. The government's got to be extending the business rates relief. They've got to be extending the furlough scheme. They've got to be continuing to provide VAT support. So as a collective, we'll lobby the government to do so. But separately, we've got to make sure we've got a recovery plan going forward. So skilling up Londoners for the skills for the jobs of tomorrow, avoiding people becoming unemployed. And that's one of the jobs that the London Recovery Board has that I'm a chair of. It's really, really important. We don't have a repeat of the 1980s, what you and I lived through. In the 1980s, we had mass unemployment in our city. Across the country, more than 3 million. We've got to avoid that happening in London, because that'll lead to a generation being wiped out. And that's why skills is important, investing in the green economy is important, and investing in future-proof jobs is important. I genuinely think if we get it right, our best years as a city could be in front of us rather than behind us. And I'll continue to be a champion and advocate for our recovery.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to move us back to the chat section and select 3 liked questions. The first one is from my borough of Brent, which is from, hold on. Right, sorry, it's from Oliver. And the question is, how are you ensuring disabled people are not forgotten in London's economic recovery? The next question is from, guess where? Waltham Forest, from Adrian Stannard, who says the development of Waltham Town Centre will go on for at least 5 years. How can the economy of Waltham be protected during this time? And who wants to visit a building site to go shopping? And the third question is from Dr. Sundas Tefik from Barnet, I hope I've got the name right, and who says, how will you support community interest companies targeting to grow food in the capital? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, for all those questions. So Oliver, thank you very much for your question in relation to how we involve disabled Londoners in our recovery. And so one of the things that we've got on the London Recovery Board is a cross-section of London's community, not just City Hall and councillors, but also members of the voluntary and community service, as well as faith communities, businesses, and so forth. And so we're making sure that we take advice from the Independent Disability Advisory Group, and we've got specialists and experts around the group whose life experiences plus expertise make sure that there is no indirect or direct discrimination in relation to a really important part of our community. I'm really proud, for example, since I've become mayor, we're on course to transform some of our tubes from being inaccessible to being step-free, gone from a quarter to a third, and continue to make progress in relation to improving the quality of life for disabled Londoners, and that includes in the recovery as well. It's really, really important. In relation to the second question about Waltham Forest, again, I'm not going to talk about the planning application for the reasons I've discussed around it being quasi-judicial, but town centres and high streets are one of the 9 recovery missions that the London Recovery Board has. One of the big challenges we have is not applications that go through the planning process. There's something called permitted development. The government is saying that it's possible for a landowner to change the use of that building without the need for planning permission, which could mean town centres and high streets across London, the shops, the leisure, the other things we've got in our high streets, the libraries, children's centres, being transformed to housing without the need for planning permission. And I know on this call is Nikki Gavron has been a really good champion fighting permit development. Council leaders of all parties are fighting the government on permit developments. Permitted development extensions from the government could be the death of the high street and town centres. The big challenge we've got going forward, though, is because of COVID, people's habits have changed in relation to where they work, more working from home, how they do leisure, the numbers of people watching Netflix and other channels, but also how people shop as well. And so it's really important, and how they eat. It's really important that we make sure that the experience of the high street and town centres is one that leads to people coming back rather than people staying at home. It's really, really important. And the question from Barnett is a really important question. We've seen in the recent past the proliferation of food banks because of food insecurity and food inequality in our city. It shouldn't take a Premier League footballer to embarrass the government to provide free school meals during school holidays. It shouldn't take a Premier League footballer, Marcus Rashford, to persuade the government to stop the obscene situation where families are given a ration of food to keep them going during the time of this awful pandemic. So we're doing work in relation to how we have sustainable food growing in our city, really important if we're going to be a green city going forward, in relation to the work we're doing around greening parts of London, the works we're doing around preserving, protecting our allotments, but the work we're doing around security of our city as well. And also to make sure we haven't got a situation where in the poorest parts of London, you can't access fresh fruit, fresh vegetable and fresh produce. One of my concerns is around obesity and the inequalities around our health. It is a fact that those who've suffered the worst because of this pandemic are the poorest, most deprived parts of our city. So again, one of our 9 missions is in relation to food inequality and addressing the very issue that our colleague from Barnet raised. And again, Navin, I'm more than happy if the gentleman wants to give his details to provide him information about the work we're doing around food insecurity. Any help or views he has, I'm more than happy to take on board.
Thank you. I've got quite a few members interested in this. Let's see what we can do within the time. Can I invite Assembly Member Sahota, please? Assembly. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, I think as part of my question addresses the question of disabilities. And of course, recovery does depend upon every citizen having a position to play in it. And I think we're going through a COVID-19 pandemic, and it's really impacted upon our mental health. And I think that one quarter of the Londoners experienced mental health problems within 2 months of the pandemic starting. So one of the issues we need to face, right, is that Londoners have been affected, their mental health has been affected, and that's been raised in the question. And I think that the mayor has done very well in establishing Thrive London, and also being very open about his own personal experiences in terms of mental health, and inviting people to talk about these issues, and that this is not something to be put away in a cupboard. We need to value that, and I think we need to prepare for that. And the other thing is about disability. Work is good for all of us, but not any work is good for us. Only good work is important. And I think disabled people need to be valued in the workplace. It isn't simply about putting a ramp to the workplace or putting a lift into the place. It's about how they feel valued in their workplace, how they're valued as contributing to the company. And this mayor has done so much to push the issue of this by establishing his good work standard and also the healthy place awards. So I think we need to pay attention to the disabilities and to the mental health as you come out of the pandemic. But I think this mayor has done a tremendous amount of work in this area, and I look forward to him really pushing this agenda in his second term. Thank you.
Assembly Member Devnish.
Mr. Khan is our third mayor. When we've had a crisis under Ken Livingstone or Boris Johnson, they were visible. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Even Labour's Gary Neville has said the mayor has been missing for 12 months. He's not turned up to 4 plenary sessions, 2 on the economy and 2 on COVID. The only thing he does well is ask the taxpayer, not the government, the taxpayer, for more money. On May the 6th, it's time for change. Vote Sean Bailey.
can I please ask members not to go into party politics? This is definitely not acceptable, and I hope Assembly Member Devenish is truly ashamed about what he has just done.
Chair, the Mayor did it earlier. I only repeated what the Mayor did earlier, Chair.
No, we are not into campaigning here. This is absolutely not on. Quite disgraceful, to be honest. Let's move on. Can I have Assembly Member?
Yeah, you said nothing when the Mayor said it. You said nothing when the Mayor was...
I'm not going to allow party politicking in the way that has just happened with the Assembly Member. That's my ruling, and that's where it stops. I have room for one. I've got a bit of time here, so I'm happy to invite Assembly Member Buff. Thank you.
To Jackie, I think, and the other people who've raised the issue of disabled people in London, the thing is, the Mayor has a problem talking to disabled people. He had to be cajoled into putting a representative of disabled organisations onto the London Recovery Board, that very board that is talking about recovering the economy. He has put in schemes at Bishopsgate, for example, that have been ruled illegal. And if you want to see what the Mayor's attitude to disabled people is, just go onto Twitter and look for hashtag talk to disabled people. And you'll see an exchange there which shows how much the Mayor has got a blind spot when it comes to consulting disabled people. The recently announced Diversity Commission, the Diversity Commission has no representatives from disabled organisations on it. And to top it all, he's now spending £500,000 of your money, please, on an appeal on the illegal Bishopsgate scheme, please, so that TfL have the right not to listen to disabled people.
Thank you, Assembly
So
Member.
those are the credentials of the Mayor when it comes to talking to the disabled Londoners who need his help.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't see a direct reply to the question, but let's move on. Assembly Member Desai, we got 1 minute left. Very quickly, you indicated. Come in, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. As we recover the economic front, it's also important that we have responsible employers. What we don't need is that people like British Gas, the management, who are using fire and rehire tactics to undermine the working conditions of the employees. We've got other employers, the latest being British Telecom, who have decided as part of a better workplace program to close gas-based sites in London and the south of England and move jobs abroad. This will mean 4,000 high-paying jobs and livelihoods will be lost and gravely damage local economies. We've had employers like the University of East London, Tate Galleries, doing the same thing, cutting their workforce. I know the Mayor has taken a strong stand on this issue. Now is the time, I would say to Londoners, everyone watching it, we need trade unions. They are a protection against bad employers, and they play a vital role in London's economic recovery. I'm a member of the GMB, and the GMB is a dispute with British Gas, not a dispute they want, but we cannot accept, they cannot accept their workforce being fired and rehired. And I know the Mayor has taken a strong stand on this against such bad management.
Thank you. Can I please, very politely but firmly, remind colleagues, Assembly members and the Mayor that this is not a platform for blatant electioneering. I will not allow that. Please bear that in mind. Let's move on to the last topic. Can I? Right. That is any other issues, topics that you want to raise which have not already been covered in the previous sections. So we can take questions from any of the issues that you want to raise. So first of all, can I welcome Barbara Van Doon from Greenwich, who wants to ask first question in this topic, please. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. I would like to ask a question. With the vaccine program currently rolled out and a priority given to the over 70s and the most vulnerable, the average age in London also being 35.6 years of age, plus London being a highly densely populated area, it seems unlikely that a significant decrease in infections of COVID-19 in London will be achieved soon. My question is this being addressed? And if yes, how? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Laura, thanks for your question. So I spent some time today with health experts across London discussing this very issue. In fact, when I said in my opening, Barbara, that there had been more than 16,000 deaths in our city, that's a figure from today. Over the course of the last 24 hours, 81 Londoners have lost their lives, 81 new bereaved families, and there have been more than 1,543 cases in the last 24 hours alone. So although it's good that the number of cases is going down, we've got to realise that it's still, in relation to per 100,000, there are far too many Londoners with this virus. There are still far, far, far more people in hospitals now than in July when the lockdown was being eased, and our intensive cares are still pretty full. And so you're right about the challenges we face. So what are we doing about it? So we've got a target to reach by the close of play Monday, 1.5 million Londoners receiving the vaccine. Because the government's completely messed up the test, trace, isolate system, they completely messed up the way we deal with, dealing with the pandemic. The only really way out we've got this virus is the vaccine. And so the target by the end of Monday is 1.5 million. And those will be your spot on those above the age of 70, those who work in the NHS care sector, and those who are clinically extremely vulnerable. Because of our population being mainly young, we're not getting the same numbers of vaccines that other parts of the countries are getting. For those reasons, basically, we're still going to make sure that the right percentage of older people get the vaccine, and that's why the chair was spot on. And I want to thank him for talking about hesitancy. He's received the vaccine. If it's safe enough for the chair of the assembly, it's safe enough for all of us. My mum's received as well. It's the next phases, though, Barbara, where it's a real challenge. We've got to make sure those below the age of 70, those below the age of 60, those below the age of 50 start receiving the vaccine as well. We're working with the NHS and public health to make sure we have massive vaccination centres across our city. We're offering events expertise to the Vaccines Minister, Nadeem Zahawi, because the next stage is really, really important as part of our recovery going forward. And so I'm confident that we will have a good rollout of the vaccine in London. We've got to make sure that young Londoners realised just because they're young, they're not immune from catching the virus or losing their lives. Two of my friends, one aged 53 and one just above 60, have lost their lives. And so we can't assume if you're below the age of 70, you're not potentially at risk of getting serious consequences by catching the virus. That's why it's so important we continue the rollout across our city. Good news. The two vaccines that have been so far brought on stream, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, we're getting plenty of that in supply. We're hoping for Moderna to come on stream pretty soon. And City Hall is working very well with the central government in relation to the rollout of the vaccine. And I'll use the opportunity, Chair, to thank Nadeem Zahawi for the collegiate way he's worked with us, but also our heroic NHS and volunteers who are doing a brilliant job, as you know, Chair, getting this vaccine rolled out across our city. We want everyone to receive the vaccine as soon as possible.
Thank you. Assembly Member Dr. Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. Look, we truly are in this all together. And of course, a vaccine is the way out of this tunnel. But we can have all the vaccines in the world we want, but they're no good to us unless we get them into the arms of people. We need to get about 80% of the population covered before we get what's called herd immunity. And today figures came out that London is doing the worst in the country for delivering vaccines. And I'm worried about that. I know that the Mayor has said that the government is working collegiately and is doing well, but there's reason to ask, why is London doing worse than the rest of the country? And I think one of the things are about logistics, right, that the centres which are giving the vaccines don't get enough notice of when the vaccine is arriving, and therefore there's no time for the GP's practices to book the patients into this appointments. And sometimes they are told that the AstraZeneca is arriving, when 24 hours ahead, they're told there's Pfizer coming. And patients are now also beginning to make choices, right? And yet I want to say, look, all vaccines are the same, but public is starting making choices, either they prefer AstraZeneca or Pfizer. And the other thing, of course, so we need to have reliability of supplies of vaccines to London. We need to have the logistics put in place so that people know when the vaccines come in, so they can be putting those appointments in place. And of course, there is the issue about hesitancy. And 50% of the population, the BMA population in this country lives in London, and we have particular issues amongst the BMA community, not exclusively, but particularly in the BMA community of hesitancy, and we need to address it. And the astonishing thing was the government put in £23 million to get local councils to get the message out to the communities, but London got only a very small proportion of it. Only the 7 boroughs got funding for it. So we needed more funding in London so we can get the message across to people of the so the myths and the misinformation can be addressed, so people can understand the value of that. We need to get. So I am concerned about London, but you're absolutely right. Until we get the vaccines into people's arms, we won't be making progress on that, and that needs to be addressed by supply, logistics, and also funding for local councils to work with the communities to get the funding rates up. And I know that the mayor has been championing this, right, on this issue. And I think that we need to do more work. But we can't. This is the only way out. We all need to take the vaccine up, and I want to reassure people that it's a safe vaccine. It's well tested, and there's no chips in it. There's no question of your DNA being infected, or your fertility being infected, or you being taken over by some super spirit. But thank you very much for letting me say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the last question. Can I now invite Samaya Bangura, who's the chair of the London Youth Assembly, to ask the question, please. Thank you. Welcome, Samaya.
My name is Samaya Bangura, and I am the chair of the London Youth Assembly. Our question to the mayor is, how will the mayor ensure that children and young people are consulted while continuing to make recovery plans that specifically impact young Londoners? For instance, when the time comes for young Londoners to go back to the physical classroom and to catch up on missed learning in preparation for upcoming exams. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Well, Samaya, I hope you aren't going to emulate the behaviour of those 3 angry men we saw earlier talking for the Conservatives. And hopefully you've seen some good things tonight that you can emulate rather than those angry men. So we're getting young people involved in some of the recovery work as well. So we've got this really good initiative called Talk London, involving young people deliberately, but also using the peer outreach group for the reasons you've said, Samir. We can't have a situation where things are done to young people. We need to involve young people in the conversations we have. I regularly speak to and listen to young people. One of the things that's concerned me is the issue of digital inequality and digital poverty in parts of London, lack of connectivity, lack of devices, and sometimes lack of skills, which is leading to inequalities in our city being widened rather than narrowed. So as part of the recovery work, which I noticed that the angry men criticised earlier on, we're involving young people in part of the solutions and engaging young people as well. And that means that some of the things we're doing around all our policies will be directly involving people like you and the group work that your group does, but also in relation to the future skills agenda as well. I had a meeting today which included representatives of the DfE, the Department for Education, about the formal reopening of schools. Schools are open for some children, staff are there. How do we open schools safely for all the other children? And the government's going to be publishing on February 22nd their roadmap, and we've made sure we've put into place working with the DfE, clear criteria of how schools can safely reopen. And we're particularly concerned about those children for whom it's a really important year with exams. I know there'll be different ways of making assessments of the grades. People get more involved, young people, in some of those decisions. I'm afraid the way young people have been let down with school closures, with colleges, with universities, with exams last summer have been awful. Just to finally end on the point that Dr. Hota made in relation to the mental ill health, the anxiety and the stress of young people as well, we can't ignore. I worry about a generation of young people being let down. One way to ameliorate that, make it less bad, is to involve young people in some of the solutions. And we'll carry on engaging with and listening to young people to make sure we have the right solutions going forward.
Thank you. I've got two members who haven't spoken before. Can I invite Assembly Member Hall first, please, to reply?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm surprised that the Mayor is so rude to my colleagues, although being surprised by what he is, I shouldn't be. So you've got an angry female here, Mr. Mayor, because instead of complaining at times about the vaccines, as Onka Sahota does, we are the envy of the world with the way we have carried on with vaccines in this country. You have spent your life complaining about Brexit. If we were still tied into the Brexit situation, we would never, ever be in the situation we're in now. As the Mayor did point out, the reason that we haven't had so many vaccines as some parts of the country is our age profile. So let's bear that in mind before we complain. We are doing extremely well. I will talk up London. We are doing extremely well, and the government is doing excessively well on our vaccine rollout. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Very briefly, we are running out of time. Assembly Member Barry.
Thank you, Chair. I want to go back to what Samir said, because I think it is so important that young people are involved in planning for the recovery. If you're a young person in London now, this crisis has been a very high proportion of your life, and it's had an enormous impact on what you must be thinking about the prospects for your future. Now, what the Mayor said earlier on about austerity happening in the future, well, austerity has been going on for an awful long time too. And if you're a young person, it's been going on for most of your life. And I work on a lot of issues to do with young people, and one of them is youth services. And youth services have suffered austerity for the past 10 years now. They've been cut back, and that is appalling when you think about the impact that young people, that youth workers can have on young people's lives. Now, the other thing that's really disturbing about the current crisis is youth unemployment. And I think we need, as an Assembly and as the Mayor, to get behind the growing calls for a universal basic income. That's a guaranteed payment against poverty. It's something that enables you to have the security to plan for your future, to go and train. And it's really, really important. And the Assembly has so far twice now declined to take a position on it. And I just hope that the Mayor will come behind the growing calls for this, particularly from young people, and listen to the young people of London and start calling for the government to start providing a basic income to everybody as the route out of poverty, as the route out of this crisis, and as the way to build up young lives that are really, really thriving in the future.
Thank you. I'm afraid we all are driven by the dreaded clock. We have run out of time for any chat questions. So we have, I'm afraid, come to an end of the session. So that's all the time we have tonight for question answer session. Thank you all for participating. Don't forget to keep an eye on our website for details of the next People's Question Time. You can also keep up to date with the work of the London Assembly on any of our social media accounts. We'd love to hear what you thought of tonight's event. Pre-registered audience members will be emailed the link to the feedback survey, which will also explain how to submit questions that we unfortunately could not take because of the time constraints tonight. May I wish everyone good night, and thank you once again for joining us. Safe journey.
Thank you. Stay safe. Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.